For those of you who were not in attendance at our prior sessions, including an initial plenary, we talked more broadly about the whole issue around cross-system collaboration and reentry from a youth perspective and a family and community perspective in the very first session. And what we explained to folks at that point was that there would be follow-up sessions that we would be doing yesterday afternoon and today, where we would drill down in more detail on a number of topics that we just really kind of dabbled in various comments or answering certain questions that came up. And this is our opportunity to really focus in on what I think has been some incredible, relatively new work and the implications of that work on some things that have actually been going on for quite a while. Some of it even predating what we've been learning in terms of what we know about adolescent brain development. And perhaps there's something reassuring to know. We could all kind of conclude for ourselves as after we've heard everyone speak and have a chance to digest it. The extent to which what we're going to be hearing in terms of some of the approaches and some of the ideas from our speaker number 2 and 3, how that relates to what we're going to hear about in terms of some of the newer information that's come out of some just amazing research that deals with adolescent brain development and neuroscience. So what we're going to do is start off with Jennifer Woolard, who is from the Georgetown University, and she is a professor of psychology. And she has been working with a number of colleagues on some fascinating research. And I think that, if I may be so bold, and I've actually heard some of her colleagues make this same point, so I feel very safe in saying this, and that is, and maybe she'll agree or not, it's not as if this has changed our views about the way we can understand what's happening with juveniles and their behavior. What we're learning is more about why is it, as opposed to what it is. The what it is, we've been seeing for a long time. We've been living with it. The why it is really, I think, what's very, very new and very informative, and will help to, I think, establish our, and complete our understanding about the why, and then ultimately will lead us into, okay, knowing that, what is it that we ought to be doing? And with regard to the what is it that we ought to be doing and some of the different options in front of us, we're going to hear from our other 2 speakers. Our second speaker is going to be Kent Berkeley. And Kent is currently Senior Associate Director at the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, and he works out of St. Louis, Missouri. At least he was in St. Louis. Are you still there? He tends to move around a lot, so if I don't keep up with him, I'm never really sure where he is now. Kent's been at juvenile justice reform and issues around reform as it relates to young people and young people that get involved in various systems for a very long time. He has focused a lot on youth engagement, on permanency planning. He's done a lot in terms of child welfare. He actually started, when we first met many, many years ago, I won't tell you how long ago, it was really about a lot of juvenile justice work. But he went on from that and got very involved in child welfare, foster care, various kinds of programs that deal with aging out of the foster care system. And so Kent really brings a very complete knowledge of both the juvenile justice system, youth development, and also what's going on in terms of child welfare. So I think you'll be very interested to hear what Kent has to say. Jeff Butts, he's another one that if I don't keep up with him, I sort of lose track at sort of where he is at a given moment. But at least as of a few minutes ago, unless it's changed.
My stuff is still there.
There you go. Okay, I feel safe in saying this then. Jeff is Executive Director of the Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York. Way back when, I became familiar with Jeff and his work. I believe it was at the National Center for Juvenile Justice, but it's even possible that it happened before that when he was at University of Michigan. And then after that, if I have the sequence right, he was at the Urban Institute, where he was director of the program on youth justice, right? And then after that, he was a research fellow at the Chapin Hall, which is located at the University of Chicago.
I started out as a foster care worker.
That's right. And as a child, Jeff, oh no, we don't need to go into that. Jeff also has been at this for a very, very long time. And he specifically, and more recently, although the seeds of it were planted, I think, a lot earlier, has focused on issues around positive youth development, and has really done some fascinating work that's still evolving, I think, that I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about with regard to this whole matter about a youth development approach and the use of resiliency and assets and strengths and focusing on models that are not just strictly deficit-oriented and punitive. And so Jeff has been at this for a very long time in a juvenile justice context. So that's what we're going to do is we're going to try as best as we can to keep everybody to around 15 minutes. Okay? And what I would ask you is to hold your questions and comments till everyone has spoken. That way we could have a collective discussion. We really do want to reserve time for comments, for questions that you have, and so we're going to try very hard to restrict ourselves, though the temptation looms loud to want to go longer, to the 15 minutes. Okay? So that's how we're going to proceed, and I will turn the mic over to Jennifer.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning. As David mentioned, I'm Jennifer Wooler, and I'm a developmental and community psychologist in the Department of Psychology and the Center for Social Justice at Georgetown University. Right now, someone is teaching my class on children, families, and the law, so hopefully that's going well. I got to skip out this morning a little bit to be with you all. Don't tell, does anyone here have a child at Georgetown? Okay, good. So that stays in this room. But I'm delighted to be here with you this morning and to do a little bit of a quick overview of developmental psych related to adolescence, and specifically, as David was mentioning, to talk a little bit about the growing research that has been coming out having to do with neuroscience and brain behavior. And certainly one of the messages that David previewed is that what we're really learning in the context of this emerging body of brain research is very much consistent with those of us that have done behavioral research over the last 30, 40 years, and those of you all that have been working in the field have probably seen. So I think that's the good news, is there's not a huge amount of surprises in terms of what we know. I'm going to wish that I had written a book with that title so that I could have potentially been on Oprah or something like that and skipped this gig. But one of the, I mean, I love you all. That didn't quite come out the way that I meant it to do. But, you know, essentially, whenever we talk about this, one of the underlying questions I think that feeds through all of it is, you know, why are they acting this way? Let's try and figure this out. Why are they acting this way? So today, we're going to blow through in record time just a couple of key aspects of adolescent development. I want to talk to you a little bit about the cautions and concerns about taking research findings and moving them into field or thinking about implications. And then these guys will do a great job of talking about the practical aspects of that. And placing our experiences with youth in their larger developmental context. So let me start just with a couple of notes about what developmental research can tell us. So generally when we talk about developmental research, and particularly when we're going to talk about the brain research, we're really talking about normative developmental behavior. Okay? The idea is that it's giving us a reference of the range of what kids are like. Across the span, okay? And I'll try to distinguish research that's focusing on this general stuff from really specific stuff that may be looking at special populations. Research, I want to remind us, talks about probabilities and likelihoods, not certainties. So I'm not going to be talking in the range of diagnosing individuals in any particular kind of way. This is really background information and can help us identify these risks and protective factors that we'll be talking about later on in the period. So a couple of cautions that follow from that then. we're really not going to be talking, particularly as we get to the brain research, about the capacity to run a brain scan on somebody and say this kid is normal or this is not. Okay, it's really not there at all. The research we're also going to see varies in quality and generalizability. So hopefully you will be able to ask some critical questions about work that's coming out that's being used to influence policy or to influence practice in some way. So at a very basic level, what we know, right, development's gradual, uneven, stops and starts, and we can see 3 14-year-olds and they can look radically different, just like we can see 3 16-year-olds, or in the case of my class, 15 21-year-olds, and they all look dramatically different, both in terms of how quickly they're changing or developing over time, as well as the pattern of change, right? What is developing at particular times? So the major areas of development that we tend to talk about include cognitive development or thinking, right? The biological and physical development, so here's all the puberty and the bodily changes that come into play. Moral development, which is particularly relevant to our group. Also thinking about identity and social development, and then competence, which leads us into the discussion of positive factors and so forth. So when we talk about cognitive and development in particular, we're really asking things like, how do adolescents think? How does their thinking differ from that of younger children or older adults? And how does their thinking affect the behavior that brings them to much of our attention when they're coming into particular systems that are involved with justice and child welfare? So a couple of highlights on this. When we talk about adolescent risk-taking, we do tend to see that risk-taking behavior peaks during the course of adolescence. This is why, right, men, you can't rent a car until age 25, right? They perceive themselves generally as less vulnerable to risk. And I want to caution, this doesn't mean that they don't see the risk. They just think that they themselves are going to be less vulnerable than the general group. And we also see this sensation seeking. This is a developmentally appropriate thing that's important for their development, right? So during the adolescent time period, they really need to have these novel sensations and experiences and excitement and stimulation and so forth. The key, of course, is to do that in a way that is safe and productive, as opposed to dangerous and unproductive. We can also talk about adolescents' temporal orientation or their future orientation. In general, they have greater difficulty thinking about the future and what we call delaying gratification, right? So we'll give you this today, or I'll give you more if you wait a week, as an example of the kind of laboratory tasks that we do. And they tend to value more heavily short-term benefits and discount risks, okay? So the payoff is more important than the potential loss that might be occurring for engaging in a particular behavior, okay? And we generally see this in the lab and in the field. Okay. So how does this connect to making decisions, this larger aspect of psychosocial development? And by that I mean both their thinking behavior and the kind of social and emotional aspects of adolescent development that we know are important. Well, these things that are developing during the course of adolescence affect a variety of aspects of everyday life and behavior that can become particularly relevant when we're talking about kids engaging in delinquent or criminal behavior, and when we're talking about them then transitioning back to the community and engaging in positive and pro-social networks and tasks that are going to help reduce the likelihood of recidivism or mitigate against some of those risks that we've seen that may have occurred earlier in their lives. Okay? One of the messages that I want to emphasize here is that I was just talking about characteristics of adolescence generally, okay? But the characteristics of adolescence generally are not determinative, in the sense that if I see that you're a risk taker, that doesn't mean that you're always going to be a risk taker. What we need to emphasize is that those characteristics interact with the youth's context and opportunities, right? Their neighborhood, their family, the programs that they may be engaged in, school, all of these kinds of things. And so certainly some of the examples up here, including previous victimization, learning difficulties, stress, and fear, can all interact with where kids are on those developmental timelines, again, to distinguish kids of the same age or the same general background and experience in terms of how they're going to act specifically in certain circumstances. So let me shift and talk specifically about brain research and brain development. And it is amazing. And I have to say, as a behavioral researcher, I don't do as much brain research as other folks. And you might sense that I'm a little bitter as I begin to talk about this, because I find that if I show people a picture of a brain, research all of a sudden becomes much more convincing than if I show them a bunch of graphs from stuff we've done in the lab. I'm working through that, so just bear with me on that individually. But the question is, all of this new brain research that we're seeing, is it important for how we develop policy and programs in the juvenile justice system and so forth? Let me give you the yes and the no. The yes, absolutely. It's helping us, as David mentioned, understand some of the biological bases of the difference that we've been seeing between adolescents and adults over the past 30 to 40 years. And as I mentioned, it can help convince people, particularly policymakers, that these differences are real, right? That they're not just put on or acted upon, but there is some underlying biological basis for the kinds of differences we see. On the other hand, right, under the law at least, it's really behavior and not anatomy that's important, right? So it's the behavior that's getting children and youth in front of us and engaged with these systems and planning for them. And this is my slightly bitter bullet here. You know, the idea that biological evidence is more real than psychological evidence is kind of naive, but that's my own issue. But also the caution I want to make is that it's really easy for folks to take the brain research and run with it. And I want to caution you that I'm a big fan of the brain research, but I think that the general media message suggests that we know a lot more than we actually do right now. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So here's a picture of the brain so that you get interested and are convinced that what I'm saying is real. Here, unfortunately, I didn't make the picture one or the one that thank you, the one that rotates. Right, yeah, I was looking for an awe or some kind of thing. So we've got the different lobes. The one that we're most interested in is the frontal lobe that's sitting right here, right, which is sometimes called the CEO of the brain. This is where we see, if you've heard the term executive function or planning or self-regulation, this is the place where all of that stuff comes together and gels together to advance kids' abilities to be able to sequence events, to integrate information, and so forth. Real quickly, the parietal lobe is where we're dealing with some issues of memory, where information from the senses are integrated. The temporal lobe down there at the bottom is also dealing with memory and visual and auditory processing and emotion. And the occipital lobe is mainly processing visual information. So just a quick orientation to the brain, but we're really going to be talking mostly about the frontal lobe here. So what do we know? There are different ways to think about the emerging research. I'm not going to give you the details right now, but I'm happy to go into them later during the Q&A if you want to. But I think for our purposes, it's most helpful to think about two kinds of systems that are operating in the brain, cutting across some of those lobes that I was just showing you. One is the socioemotional system, and that mainly is involving the limbic system and ventromedial and orbitofrontal parts of the frontal lobe that I was showing you. And then the cognitive control system, okay, that involves the upper outside area of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Now, these are not actually systems that you could see if you opened up somebody's brain, right? But it's just a way for us to model the different things that we think are involved here. So let's talk about the socio-emotional system and what that means. Here we're talking about processing emotions, social information, so my interactions and cues with other people, reward and punishment, which are certainly critical factors. This system tends to undergo major changes in early adolescence when we see hormones and puberty kicking in. Okay, so we're really seeing in the early adolescence, 11, 12, 13, so forth, that this is where this system is undergoing a fairly dramatic amount of change. And what we think that that results in is this sensation seeking I was talking about, that's a developmentally appropriate part of growing up. Increased or easier emotional arousal, so the kind of on a high 1 minute and then the next in the depths of despair, or reacting, what we would think of as adults as overreacting to certain kinds of things, and increased attentiveness to social information, right? What's that person thinking? What's that saying? How are we interacting? And what are people thinking about me? The cognitive control system is that more deliberate, planful part of the brain, right? Weighing costs and benefits, thinking ahead, if I do this, this could happen, and then this could happen, and regulating impulses, okay? The ability to keep yourself from doing something or to interrupt once you've started doing something, okay? This, in contrast to the early adolescent part I was just talking about before, develops well into the mid-20s. As a college professor, I can absolutely guarantee this is true. This is not something that is restricted developmentally just to the teenage years, okay? And what we see coming out of that is this more planful, self-regulated behavior by the time you guys are able to rent a car, right? More impulse control, emotion regulation, planning ahead, reasoning, and so forth. Okay. So what do those two things mean? So those conclusions I was just telling you come both from the brain scan research and the behavioral research, okay? We can't link them causally yet because we're not intervening in someone's brain and seeing how it turns out, but we see the patterns go together. So we've got a socioemotional system that's easily aroused, highly sensitive to social feedback, and we've got that cognitive control system that's still developing well into young adulthood, okay? So what we see is a really interesting combination here, right, of the, as some colleagues have described it, right? The engine is revving, and they're ready to drive the car, but they don't quite know how to control it yet, okay? So we have a good understanding of the neurobiological underpinnings of these qualities, okay? What does it not mean? This is what I was talking about when we talk about carrying some of this research a bit too far when we move into policy and program circles. Doesn't mean that teens don't know right from wrong. Doesn't mean that they're the same as young children. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be held responsible. Doesn't mean they're all the same, okay? And particularly with some Supreme Court opinions over the past 5 or 6 years that have come out that have cited some of this research, I think there is a somewhat unfortunate tendency to really focus on the deficits here and to compare teenagers to children, to mentally retarded adults, right? And that's not really how the brain is working at this point. It's still in progress, okay? But it's an impairment only in the sense that they're not done progressing yet, okay? It's not impairment in a damaged sense of word for most kids, okay? So what can it not tell us? It can't tell us where we should draw the age boundary. It can't, as I said, tell us who's immature and who's mature. So who's done progressing, and we want to hold them responsible in a way that kids who aren't done progressing aren't. It can't distinguish guilt from innocence. It can't identify bad brains. If I leave you with one thing, please leave with that, that we cannot do a scan and look at a brain and figure out who's bad and who's good. It can't tell us what treatment potential is, right, or amenability is at this point. And as David mentioned, it doesn't already change anything that we already knew about the differences between adolescents and adults. So there are a lot of implications, I think, for working with youth with this combined brain behavior set of findings that are growing. And I'm probably coming pretty close to my 15 minutes, and so I'm going to just whip through these a little bit, and we can talk about them more during the Q&A if you want. But I think there are certainly lots of implications that come down to the day-to-day interaction with kids, to educating the folks that are not in this room but are in the justice system and in the treatment and community system who are responding and working with these kids at the level of communication, at the level of expectations for behavior, at the level of understanding that kids can be inconsistent and developmentally appropriate so from one moment to the next, right? That as we're going through that progress of development, there can be the equivalent of backsliding and moving forward, and that may not be something that's intentional on the part of the kid. That capacities in one area may not mean that they're developed in the other area. So a great thinker may not have great self-control, right, or emotion regulation. And we certainly know the power of peer groups and families and so forth in their behavior. I just want to touch briefly, because I know we'll talk about it later, on this issue of competence, right, and the idea that children need to be good at something. The brain and the behavior research I was presenting tends to emphasize, as I mentioned, the differences from adolescents to adults and tends to paint in some way a slightly negative picture, I think, or is at risk for painting a negative picture because we're talking about things that kids aren't developed yet to do or don't necessarily have full capacity to do. And so it is certainly important for us to think about what are the strengths and the competencies that we have when we have kids coming in front of us and working with kids in front of us. And so certainly that success requires both the opportunity to demonstrate that success, right? The recognition of small steps towards successful behavior, coaching to reduce that failure. It is tough when we talk about kids who have got lower motivation or aspirations or have not had the chance to clearly identify their competencies and talents to date for us to be able to do that. But again, all of this is laid on top of that developmental progression of thinking about cognitive control and socio-emotional development. That's progressing well, as I described earlier, well into the late teens and the early 20s. Okay? So I have a few more slides, but I think I'll leave it there so we can turn to Kent, and then we can come back and talk about some of the specifics of the research and the implications if you all want to do that. Okay? Thank you.
All right, good morning. Let's see. I have never been one to really like the whole PowerPoint thing, but you all expect it now, so I'm going to go there, and now I'm going to disregard my PowerPoint, okay? Because I've decided that I've heard so many interesting things in the first session, and what Jennifer just said is that I always like to just kind of connect things and go on the go, which always drives my friend David crazy, but he's come to accept it after all these years. So, first of all, I guess in listening to this morning's session, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do, just so you can understand why we have the point of view that we have. And then I'm going to try to tie it to some of these things that you all are wrestling with. But one of the things I guess I want to do in thinking about this morning's presentation about criminogenic need and non-criminogenic need, and what are some of the things that we do when we approach the work we do, you know, we would not say that at Jim Casey we are only concerned with the criminogenic need. We are also looking at the non-criminogenic needs, which are related, which can be barriers, as you heard this morning, and which can be relevant in other ways. And so I'm going to illustrate that by saying, first of all, how many of you all have kids out here? All right, good. And you all have some teenagers. Now, do you all keep grandparents involved in the conversation or something like that? So the last time that you picked up the phone, and I have a teenage daughter that's teaching me all this stuff firsthand, 16, my grandparents said, you know, how's Gabriella doing? I will tell you that the first thing I said was, she wasn't arrested this week. That's not where I start. That's not how I define success, right? I mean, we want more than that, is my point. And so that, you know, so criminogenic need is great. It's a good way of targeting resources for knowing what your purpose is. But you need partners out there who are doing some of this other work, both in the communities, both in potentially finding resources in the child welfare system when you have these dual jurisdiction kids. And so that's where some of this is going to connect in. It's going to be, not only has my daughter not been arrested this week, but actually we have some real well-being indicators where we're seeing some progress, okay? So that's kind of how I'm going to try to piece this together. And if you look at my first slide here, now after hearing this morning's session, we'll skip down to the bottom, the last bullet there, which basically says, and we're at the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, we were created by our parent foundations, Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Casey Family Programs Foundation. And the reason that they thought it was necessary to create an organization that would deal specifically with young people who are in the foster care system, who are older, and who are on a trajectory to age out, meaning they weren't achieving legal permanence by the time they were 18, so they were, quote, on their own, so to speak, is because the outcomes that they were experiencing were truly egregious. I mean, we were seeing it, you know, in incarceration rates, we were seeing it in homelessness, we're seeing it in teen pregnancy that was unplanned, and, you know, by age 21, I mean, we're having like 50% of the females we were seeing were pregnant, they were aging out of care, things like that were of concern to us. So they said, you all need to look at this subpopulation within the foster care system. Now, the slide that I don't have, see why I hate PowerPoint, is that the second slide after hearing this morning's presentation is one that I would have included. So I'm going to describe this to you because it's very easy. Picture a graph, if you will. This is what's happening in the foster care system. We are reducing the number of kids in foster care on an average basis. So if you see a graph right now, you're going to see a steady downward line. If you're looking at the 2000s, and each year we're seeing fewer and fewer kids in foster care. Right? That we think is probably a good thing, right? On the other hand, right next to it, picture a graph that says the number of people aging out of care. And again, when I mean aging out of care, they're those kids that are not achieving permanence, are not leaving to a family, and they're kind of, quote, out there on their own for the most part. We've got the same kind of an arrow, only it's going the opposite direction, right? It's going this way. So we asked some of your colleagues at Chapin Hall, Jeff, to look at that for us and say, you know, can you tell us what that means, what's going on there? And one of the conclusions they reached is that at first we thought, ooh, we're doing a worse and worse job with the older kids in foster care. And what we learned is, no, you're just doing the same crummy job you've always done. What's really happening is that younger kids in care are now starting to experience better outcomes as a result of better practice that's in place. And so my point for telling you that long story is that I think that a foster care system that is designed exclusively, for instance, on younger children, and a practice model that's developed around the needs of younger children doesn't really serve the needs of the older children as well as it could. And so for you all out there, if you've got on your caseloads or if you're dealing with young people, I would say look at Jennifer's research and think about that same analogy applied in a little different way. If you've got a 35-year-old on your caseload or someone that's in your program or someone that you're working with, think about in terms of brain development and what we know about behaviorally, and think, are the things that we're doing going to be as targeted and as effective if we do the same things with our 22-year-olds that are there? Or even more if you have someone who's actually under the age of 18, if you've got a juvenile program below that. And I'm going to suggest the answer is no. So think about that as we're talking. I'm going to, real quickly, this is not, the only reason I'm showing you this is how at Jim Casey we take our work. The middle area are the outcome areas that we're tracking. So we have young people who we call Opportunity Passport participants, people that we work with that are taking 2 surveys a year. And they are designed to help us track their achievement in certain outcome areas. And you can see those listed there over the course of time that they participate in the programs where we have Jim Casey sites around the country. What we ask is that, when you say, do you have fidelity to your model, basically, if you're going to use the terms that you all are probably familiar with, we would say, well, we determine if you have fidelity if you are implementing all 5 of those core strategies. And so you can see we're talking about youth engagement, we're talking about partnerships and resources, research evaluation and communications within the community, public will and policy, and increased opportunities and economic success for these young people. So there have to be certain activities designed around all those areas. They work together. Hopefully we get better outcomes. Okay, I'm going to skip this one because you already know what we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to ignore it anyway. And so I will say that I think this next slide is important because it's right where Jennifer was pushing us. And it's one of the things that we've struggled with. And when she had a slide, maybe, I don't know, 4th or 5th slide, she said one of the things that happens is that, there are a lot of people that are taking this brain research and running with it and going the wrong direction. And she talked about the Supreme Court. And I'd like to say I've been one of the biggest abusers over the time because it's when it served my purposes. And I started way back in the 80s, and I will tell you that, as David said, I started out as a public defender. I was in the JJ side. That's where my interests were in juvenile justice reform. And back then, we didn't really even have MRIs, So if you wanted to find out about a juvenile brain, you basically had to take a live brain and slice it up and look at it, and people frowned on that. So what's happened is that
they still do.
They still do. Okay, all right. Well, but we don't need to do it anymore, so it's irrelevant if they frown on it or not. So now we know a lot more. And so back then, what would happen, of course, is I would have someone who was up on a transfer hearing, and I would be one of those people that would say, my juvenile client doesn't know anything. Look, they're impulsive. We know what they're telling us about brain research is they really can't help themselves, And of course, then take it to the next level and say things like, they might not even know right from wrong, and maybe they're incompetent to stand trial, and blah, 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 blah. Stuff that wasn't really based in good research, but it was stuff that, as an advocate at the time, you thought you would do. The struggle we have now, of course, is that's an end that doesn't get us very far. In a very narrow and artificial environment of a transfer hearing, or even in a capital murder case, like the language that we see in Roper versus Simmons and some of those things, we see even the Supreme Court probably taking it to its illogical application in certain extents. That can be helpful to a certain group of advocates. But when I was at the Vanderbilt Legal Clinic, I would also have a client that would come in the next week and have a whole different array of interests around child welfare outcome. And of course, my big gripe then would say, well, why aren't you listening to what my client says his needs are? Why aren't we including my client in the decision-making process? A completely a different set of arguments I'm making, and therefore that's why we're getting bad results. So I think one of the things on the last bullet here that we're seeing is that, the National Juvenile Justice Network is saying, let's frame the research in a way that is respectful and effective, focus on opportunity investment in education, and not on youth as incompetent, reckless, and irrational. I think that's important. All right, the next slide will tell you that we have a point of view at Jim Casey. And we are pretty far on the continuum of deference to young people, and their decision-making should be given a lot of weight. But we don't do it in isolation. And what we say is that we know young people developmentally are in a different place, so we got to think about the way that we provide supports and tools and training to help them in the areas where they may have a special challenge, but when you put that effort in the front end, you're going to get much better decisions that are much more relevant and ethical to the world they live in, and help them hopefully achieve better outcomes and help people out here serving these people make their jobs a lot easier. And I'm going to go ahead and let you kind of read down, and what the first list bullets are is when we started, one of the big parts of our work was around youth-adult partnerships. and what some of these community partnership boards were doing. And we found that one of our lessons through our demonstration phase of our project was that certain groups were getting good outcomes and certain groups weren't, and some were effective and some weren't. The ones that were not effective, we basically learned, were tokenism. You know, a bunch of adults would get together, make a decision about something and say, oh, we got to have the stamp of approval for a young person, now let's bring them in. That was a very different situation than bringing them to the front end, having a collegial relationship, making sure that not only are young people trained to get the most out of this, but so are the adults who are participating in it, so that they understand what's going on developmentally with young people and that those partnerships can be effective. Here's one of the things that's really interesting in the world of child welfare. How many of you all have experience in either the child welfare system or someone like Jeff who did some foster care work? Okay, a few of you all. One of the things that we talked about, kind of the end all, and you're looking at outcomes and data in child welfare for success is, do you achieve permanence for young people, right? I mean, it's the big trifecta. You're talking about permanence, you're talking about safety, and we talk about safety a little differently sometimes than the justice people do, and then we're talking about well-being. One of the things that we have found recently with older youth is that the whole world of success was kind of defined in, did you achieve legal permanence? And that was defined as either you were successfully reunited with your family and the judge signed off on it, we had guardianship in place for that young person, or they were adopted, okay? So they end up basically leaving in some kind of court-sanctioned family. What happened is we realized that a lot of young people, because of the circumstances under which they entered the system or the timeline for success, were kind of identified real quickly as, ooh, we're not going to get permanence for this young person. So they would almost kind of fall in that pile of, well, we'll just give them the standard services. What young people have told us is that the way you view permanence is not necessarily the way we view permanence, and that we look at this in terms of quality of relationships. And there are certain things that we need, and we can construct what we consider permanence through understanding what we need in terms of the quality of the relationships. I think that the reason I'm mentioning this and going into a little more detail than probably you want is I think there's some real opportunities in the field, in the justice field right now, to think about how we work with families. Think about it in a way in terms of what are some of the real indicators that we're learning out there in a qualitative way that we can look at that are non-threatening to help us achieve better outcomes? Because one of the things we kept hearing is that it's important for the people who are re-entering to enter into a network of support. Part of that network of support either needs to be families or someone, or a supportive network of people that are in combination with family helping this young person get what they need. So I'm going to, I think we'll just go down and say, talking about transition plans, because I know you all are using instruments to help develop plans. And so when you think about it, one of the things that's really important that we're working with, and through the new legislation on the foster care side called the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, they've got this new requirement about transition planning. And they actually have the language in there about being youth-directed. And so I think that's one of the most important things. And when you start understanding where your clients are and what their capabilities are, and when you realize that even if their decision-making, because of their age, is something that if you just put them in a vacuum and let them make a decision might be a cause for concern, that with the right supports in place and with their inclusion in the process of developing these plans and getting where you need to go, I think your likelihood of getting success is going to be much greater. Jeff?
Okay. Thank you. Those of you who saw me playing with my phone, I wasn't actually goofing off. I was trying to find this article that I wanted to start out by mentioning. This is breaking news. I was reminded of this a second ago. On Tuesday, this article came out. It was from a conference, I think it was here in DC, the Association for the Advancement of Science, and it shows the interdepartmental or interdisciplinary interests in all this. 2 criminologists did a presentation where they'd been studying brain research. You know where I'm going. And this is international news. I'm reading the report from The Telegraph, the paper in the UK. Researchers believe that violent tendencies have a biological basis and that tests and brain imaging can pick them up in children as young as 3. Yeah. That's where we began.
I'll just rock quietly over here.
Fetal position.
Right, exactly.
Right. So I just want to make a few points before we open it up to conversation. I think it's important, as Jennifer said, it's wonderful that we have this new knowledge coming out. And again, I've also been in meetings where people see the brain, the one that rotates and you got colors, and especially when it's animated and the colors fire. And I once walked up to a researcher at one of these meetings and I said, you've persuaded me that people who take drugs have brains that are more purple than other people. I think purple was the code. And I said, but can you tell me how I would know if I had a purple brain? If I was suffering the effects of this and my brain was beginning to fire differently, how would I subjectively know that? And he looked at me for a long time and he said, well, I think you'd always be on the verge of doing something. I don't know how good this guy was, but that's as deep as I got, right? But I don't know about you, but when I sit in these meetings and I hear people talk about brain functioning and cognition and thinking skills, I start to get really creeped out by all this stuff. It's true. We were talking before about our intellectual ancestry and who we trained with, and I mostly was trained in and sat through classes that were sociology and social work and social services. So I mainly think about how behavior and organizational systems to respond to behavior fit within the larger social structure and how we define things. And it's hard for me to turn that lens off when I'm hearing people talk about behavior. And so it's important that we have this brain science coming out. And I like Jennifer's 2 points. Well, the one that said it makes evidence more real. On her slide, she used the term laypersons, and I took that as a synonym for elected officials. I don't know.
I can neither confirm nor deny that right now.
But it is important that people, and I think we do. Over the past 10 years, I think if you met county commissioners, state legislators, people at the federal level, it's more understood now and more accepted that intellectual development, cognition, and especially the maturity of judgment does not suddenly happen when the state legislature decides to define someone as an adult for the purposes of criminal prosecution. It is a biological thing, it's a developmental thing, and people go at different rates, but it's certainly not surprising that people at the ages of 18, 19, 20, 21 are not fully formed, and they don't have all the characteristics we think of as adult cognitive functioning. And that's important that we all know that, because we need to know who we're dealing with when we're trying to work with an adolescent, trying to affect them, trying to change their behavior, and help them navigate their way through the period of adolescence to get to adulthood. That's a very challenging thing, and I'm sure all of us remember having gone through all those challenges. And it's important we know who they are and know what their world is like. But that doesn't mean that brain scans and pictures of purple brains point us in a direction to intervention, or even to understanding what got this person in our office, what got this person arrested and brought them in. And the real danger to me is that all of this science and all of this knowledge implicitly makes us think that we now understand the formation and development of criminal behavior, and here it all is. It's all in thinking errors and brain development. Because I think it's important for all of us to remember that crime is a social definition. It's behavior that we don't tolerate as a society, and then we impose our organizational power, the power of the state and our bureaucracies and organizations, to try to change that behavior. But as everything in America, it comes with a little bit of racism, a lot of class bias, disregard for poverty and environment. There are all those social factors that come along with that. And it's important that we not just think, oh, now we understand it's about thinking errors and brains. And the problem with this is, I think we all should remember the wise words, or the wise caution of the pop star from the 1980s named Thomas Dolby, who had a song called Blinded by Science. And it's important that we not become blinded by science, that we remember that these are scientific findings and we're helping to understand something, we're developing more knowledge, but there's not a direct translation into what we should do. It is important that we pay attention to evidence. And Ed talked about, everyone has a theory of what causes crime. And I have stories just like his. I've learned not to answer the question when taxi drivers say, what brings you to, and then name the town. And I don't give them an answer, because then I get 10 minutes of theorizing and homespun remedies, and most of them include the phrase, they need a good knock upside the head. So everyone has a theory. And so once you start departing from the standard of real evidence, of course, you're opening yourself up to everyone's homespun remedies, and that's bad. But hewing too closely to what we consider evidence is also blinding, because evidence in our society is purchased. It doesn't arise naturally. There's not, Bill Gates isn't out there funding all this research to try to find out what causes crime and how to work with young people. People make decisions about where to invest in the search for evidence, and we only find high quality evidence when we pay for it. But if you think about the evidence as a pyramid or a triangle, And it goes from the base, which is everyone's homespun remedy and common sense notions and things they thought up while they were taking a shower. And then you go above that, and there might be studies that are based on qualitative narratives, experience. You go above that, and you have something we might call quasi-experimental designs, where we look at one group of kids and compare them to another group that's sort of similar, but it's not controlled very well. And at the very top of the pyramid are random assignment studies, experimental designs with replicated implementation, implemented in multiple places with multiple populations where the findings are robust and they hold up. That very top of the triangle is very expensive. It's very expensive to do those kind of studies, and it's where most of what we talk about when we say evidence-based programs comes from. And to get to the top of that triangle, it's a competition. Researchers are competing, program sites are competing, everyone's trying to attract grant dollars. We don't spend a lot of money on research on this issue in this country. And so to get the few dollars that are available is a competition. And again, when I said in America, things always come with a little bit of racism, a lot of class bias. Who wins those competitions? Well, if your theory of change, if your theory of working with young people involves community-based solutions, you're not going to win that competition. You win the competition when your solution fits the dominant culture. And the dominant culture around crime and justice right now is people are involved in crime because there's something wrong with them, they're defective, they have thinking errors, they have bad brains. So if your proposal comes in to a place like NIDA or NIH and it sounds very sciencey and it's all about brain function, you have a greater chance of ending up in the top of that pyramid. With very few exceptions, do people who have a more social structural approach to crime get to the top of the pyramid. So if we only shop for policies from the very top of the pyramid and have this standard that we only look at evidence that's backed up by these random assignment studies, we're in trouble. But it's a tension you have to live with, because if you abandon the standards of science, then you're back to asking the cab driver what we should do. So the best way to go about this is to be aware of how rigorous the evidence is, but not to be blinded by science and not to have this bright line where something's either evidence or it's not. But that's a difficult thing to do in our culture. And the last thing I want to say is, and again, I go back to hearing Ed this morning, and I like his presentations, he's an entertaining guy. But when he goes through, he dismisses all this stuff about the conventional thinking. So you ask me what keeps someone out of crime, and I'm still going to say a job, a place to live, and all these like basic social supports. So there's no evidence for that. He says it's crap because there's no good science behind it. And to dismiss something like physical activity, like how could we not accept the premise that being healthy is good? That having physical activity, having a good diet, everything else, how could we reject that because we don't have any random assignment studies behind it yet? Well, he goes through his list of things that he thinks we should focus on, and these are my own translations of them, but things like unrealistic sense of one's own power and value, a lack of empathy for others, disregard for other people's pain, impulsiveness, disregard for conventional rules and norms, and a sense of invulnerability. That might be correlated with the probability that you'd be a criminal, or it'd be correlated with the probability that you'd have an excellent career on Wall Street. The very things, taking advantage of others, disregard for other people's pain, all these are things that our society rewards unless you choose to use them in pursuit of a goal of which we disapprove. So it's a social construction, and again, that doesn't tell you exactly what to do with the 15-year-old in your office, but it's important that we not lose sight of that and not be blinded by science and be too simple-minded about all these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
One comment on
Let's proceed in this way. Let's let everybody take a chance to weigh in just for a short moment, because they've all heard each other. Let them go at it just for a little teeny bit of time, and then let's open up to the floor. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, mine's just a very quick comment, and I'm just going to say at Jim Casey right now, we are actually in the process of going through the whole research design so that we can undertake a randomized controlled trial of the initiative. And I say that to not draw a conclusion about the value of the randomized controlled trial. I think it has value. I will say that in the context of we have Casey in our name, it is very expensive, and we have an opportunity to do that, and there are probably many other good programs and approaches out there that are not going to be given that opportunity, and I'm not convinced that those are not of also a very important value. So my point being, I'm living through that right now, And you know, what we did do was we had a demonstration project, and we certainly would have, you know, an evidence-based approach, one that, and you know, and so I don't know as we go up that pyramid what the cost effectives and the value is in the grand scheme, but I did want to just kind of reinforce that yes, I'm living that firsthand, and I think that's a very good point. I'm glad you made it.
Jennifer, any particular reactions that you would like to publicly enunciate?
Go on the record about prefrontal lobes? No, well, in the sense that I agree with a large part of what Kent and Jeff were talking about, in the sense that really, I think as I was trying to emphasize, the cautions around the science are really realizing that that's one tool in the toolbox for thinking about how we go forward. And the notions of prevention and positive youth development, I do want to say that there can be a science underneath that as well, which I know that you all know and talk about. And so this idea of using science appropriately and using it constructively, I guess I would encourage you all to think about how you build that into your own programs, because there are going to be very few that are going to get the amazing randomized, controlled, double-blind design. And there are actually some critiques about whether that, I think as you were beginning to hint, Kent, is the most appropriate way to evaluate programs when nothing in real life is ever a randomized, double-blind, controlled design when we're dealing with kids. But yeah, let me leave it at there.
But anecdotally, we all think scared straight's great, right?
No.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? No, but I mean in the general public. And of course, we know that it does have a high effect. Unfortunately, it's a negative one. So we got it. There is a balance to strike.
Okay, so let's open this up. Anything is fair game. Let's get off the horse manure. But anything else is fair game. Comments, questions about what you might have heard here, or if you want to direct questions that tie into some of what you perhaps heard Dr. Latessa say to any of our presenters, that's fair game also.
What about gender differences in the development of the brain? Did you look at that in your study, and if so, were there any differences?
So I didn't do the brain fMRI stuff that we were talking about before, but in looking at the research, part of, I think, let me hedge my answer to what I'm saying to you. Part of the challenge is when we're talking about like the fMRI brain stuff, we're generally talking about pretty small samples that are going to be going through this this kind of procedure. And there are some terrific studies that have come out from Jay Geed and some other folks at the National Institute of Health, again, focusing on normative brain development, that are just, he's been having the same kids come back year after year to really get that longitudinal sense of how is the brain changing over time. I would be hesitant to make any declaration about gender-based differences beyond the fact that as we see differences between girls and boys, for example, in the trajectory for puberty and all other kinds of things, that it is likely that that has got a biological basis to it. And so we're going to see some of that in the brain, I think, as we go forward. But I would be hesitant, at least in my read of the research, to talk about anything much more than that in terms of gender differences.
In their study, did they look, the clients that they used, were they even in female and male?
That's right. So the question was, did they use both males and females in the different studies? And what I was reporting was kind of an aggregation of a number of different studies, so I'd have to do the unusual for me, which is to say, I don't know, and to go back and take a look, but it's a great question.
I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball and be a little clairvoyant here and take us 10 years from now. We're back at this conference. What have we done, if anything, about programming based on the brain studies? Where do you think that's going to go? Or do you see it as many other physiological studies have been co-opted by Pfizer or Lilly, and now we're giving drugs to adolescents because there's some neurophysiological changes that can result as we've studied the brains. We've come up with next Ritalin or Saylor kind of answer to what's going on with these criminogenic tendencies in adolescents.
I guess, I would think about it a little differently, and I think our knowledge about how young people develop is really more about what that means for the adult behavior. and how do we respond as much as what does that mean about what we do to a child or the young person. And so my response to you is that what I'm hoping is going to happen is that some of these very artificial timelines and barriers and definitions about service are re-examined. And one example I would give is like in the Fostering Connections to Success Act, where you're saying now that foster care support is something that can be paid for by federal money, and it can go beyond the age of 18. So, you know, these kind of these fantasies that, you know, on an 18th birthday, that metaphysical moment in time, you know, a person goes from being a child to an adult is silly, and it makes no sense. And so my hope is that with this increased information, we're going to start making developmentally appropriate responses and not have those dictated by artificial parameters.
Jeff, you want to talk at all?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I think your question is well-founded. I think if there's one thing I know about this country is if there's money to be made, we'll do it. So if there's a pharmaceutical that comes out that's presented and marketed as a way of reducing negative behavior, it'll sell and there'll be an industry behind it. That would be really unfortunate, but I don't think there's any reason to predict we would suddenly change.
What a downer. Thanks, Jeff.
Given what we know now about adolescent brain development, what are your thoughts and recommendations for working with key adults in their lives?
With working with key adults?
Yeah,
in their
family
lives?
members, key adults, things like that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a delicate balance, right? Because again, as I mentioned early on, this research is really talking about adolescents as a class, right? So messages that we take from this, or that I hope that we take from this, that I'm encouraging you to take from this, is that we see the same kinds of behaviors in adults, some adults that we see in adolescents, right? And so the question is, what makes adults, one of the questions is, why would we think of adults and adolescents any differently? And I think this brain research helps us understand that it's much more likely that adolescents as a class who are engaging in these behaviors, as a group who are engaging in these behaviors, are doing so because of where they are developmentally. And that doesn't mean that when they're 25 or 30 or 40 or 50, they're going to be engaging in the same kinds of behaviors or thought processes or things like that. So I guess one of the messages in thinking about working with adults is figuring out how adults in their lives, is figuring out how we translate, and if we translate some of this work into the day-to-day interactions that we're dealing with families, right? I would not take this work and then say, you know, if I'm working with a family, well, it's probably because his frontal lobe is underdeveloped. I mean, that's, in a certain sense, that's kind of meaningless in a day-to-day interaction, right? But I think what it can emphasize is understanding development as a context and as a process. So it may very well be that the kinds of behavior that we're seeing, that we're struggling with, has some aspects that are not all intentional, you know, antisocial, I'm trying to do all of this, you know, intentionally. Again, not to excuse the behavior, but just, I think, to talk about development in a larger context. I don't know if that successfully dodged your question or not, but that would be my sense.
And we should also just continue to work and develop what we already know. The whole, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but the whole mentoring idea, especially with youth, is very valuable. There's some evidence behind it, but we haven't yet done evidence that's targeted on the kind of young people we work with. Most of the research, when you look up mentoring, it's with very pro-social, sort of, you know, Boy Scouts, and we do need a research base that shows that mentoring can have an impact on working with, whether we call them at-risk, disconnected, whatever name you want to use, young people. And if we start doing that research, we may be able to discover things that we think we know now that we don't. Because, again, mentoring lessons come out of a different population. So maybe it's not all about the, you know, the length, the duration of the match, or the mentoring match, in other words. So we're right now operating on a knowledge base which was developed in a way kind of inappropriately, because it's working on a different base. It's good that we have a knowledge base because people do believe in mentoring, and so to capitalize on that right now is very critical, but the work is not done.
I just thought of one other thing, and I was reflecting back to when my son was 2, you know, and driving me totally batty, and I was saying, you know, I can't believe that he's throwing a tantrum right here in the middle of Costco. I've got to leave right now. And, you know, my mother said, this is developmentally appropriate behavior, right? So I guess to follow up, I think one of the lessons is understanding what developmentally appropriate behavior is. So like I was saying before, sensation seeking is an appropriate normative things that kids are supposed to be doing. We want to try to channel that, you know, into something that's going to not compromise their life chances that much, but still enable them to have those experiences and to learn from those experiences. So maybe the temper tantrum's not a great analogy, but in thinking about the day-to-day, you know, work with families and kids, I guess that's one of the messages that I would take from the brain and the behavior research, is thinking about what's developmentally normative and appropriate.
Can I come in on this one? I mean, I know I'm not a panelist, but I cannot resist. Those of you who know me know I've been incredibly well behaved. That's good. Get pass this around. I think what's been happening, particularly through the Supreme Court, is pretty interesting. These have been very close decisions, by the way. These are 5-4 decisions, aren't they, Ken? I mean, so it wouldn't take much to swing it in another direction. And given the way things are sort of in flux, I don't know how much we can depend on anything lasting anymore. I mean, I think there's a double-edged sword to where this is all going. And I think, Jennifer, you may have been alluding to this point. And that is you know, you can make a case as a class that there's something very distinctive about adolescents, and therefore that could be used to justify dealing with them in a very different way, having a juvenile justice system, because developmentally they're very different, they're not as culpable, they're not as mature, they're more incompetent, they're more like somebody who's, you know, developmentally disabled or insane, right? I mean, that's, in a way, that's the, and Jeff, you spoke to this issue too. So if you take it to its illogical extreme, and this may have been partly your point, what you end up saying is that they're so incompetent that actually some of the things that we now extend to them, maybe we ought not be doing. You know, maybe we're allowing them too much too early. You could go the opposite way with this. And this point has actually been made by a number of people. I think it's a slippery slope that we need to be careful about, because I think it could be very badly misused. And I'll let you answer in a second. The other point I want to make is, you know, I think from an intervention point of view, if we understand why, along the lines that Jennifer was describing, it hopefully will allow more and more people to recognize why it is that certain things that we do that are very, very punitive and not having the desired effect, why that might be the case, and why we need to look at other ways to sort of connect with these kids where they are. That we've got to be able to make connections with them, that we've got to be able to think about ways that ultimately we can have an impact on them, and it's going to take a lot of creativity, recognizing that in certain areas they're not really going to be necessarily receptive to the message. So you might want to change the message. You might want to change the messenger. Maybe it's a mentor. Maybe it's somebody who's in their peer group. Maybe it's a pro-social peer, their age. I mean, I think you could be thinking about a lot of things that would allow us to try different approaches to connect with kids. But most importantly, I think it should say to us that there are some things that are being done that are very restrictive, very punitive, are in fact creating arrested development, to use some terminology that your colleagues have coined, so that it's actually getting in the way of their being able to develop in a reasonable way. And maybe they started out already with the deck stacked against them, and now we have increased that deck stacked against them, because the kinds of things that should be happening to help them advance in adolescent development are not there, because they're in places where that's not the kind of exposure to things that they're getting. So I think you could take this, again, one was a caution about watching out where it's taking us. The other is, let's utilize it to actually think about why some things that we're doing that we ought not be doing are things that we should discard, and thinking more broadly about various approaches that are going to connect with these kids where they are. That's where I like some of the cognitive behavioral work, because what it's saying is, you know, if you're talking about someone who's pre-contemplative versus contemplative versus ready, you're going to think of techniques that are different, and you're going to try different things to sort of connect with them. And some of it may not last very long, and you have to strike while the iron's hot. I mean, I think these are all things that should allow us to realize that there's some things that we should do and try. There's some other things it's time to stop doing. We understand why it's not working, and hopefully that provides a little more evidence at whatever level of evidence we're talking about, so that there's more acceptance of certain things that we're doing that are really producing very harmful effects.
I just wanted two things. One is what you were last saying, David, I think is incredibly important. And so we've written a little bit about kids who are transferred, right, and thinking about adult correction systems as developmental contexts. And would we expect productive, on-track development to occur for kids who are growing up in adult jails or in really punitive kinds of things? And I think the answer is reasonably no. And I think that connects with some of the things that you were saying, David, about what would we expect what we're doing, given what we know about development, to be putting kids on a trajectory towards more positive development or simply exacerbating the kinds of things we're talking about. I did want to come back real quickly to the caution that you had about this emphasis, as I was saying, on deficit in a sense when we talk about comparison, and how, and I think you brought this up, Kent, too, about, you know, how on the child welfare side you were talking about the degree to which kids should be consulted and their opinion taken into account. And we've actually, my research colleagues and I have been taken to task on this very issue. And so at the risk of shilling for myself, maybe I'll add this reference on when I post the slides, but we engaged in a little back and forth debate in a journal I'm sure you all read every month, The American Psychologist, which is fascinating to some of us. But we talked about that very notion, coming out of the issue that the American Psychological Association had submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court arguing that teenagers should be allowed to make decisions about reproductive health and abortion and contraception, but then also argued that they should not be held responsible when we're talking about a death penalty case. And so we kind of go through the argument there and say that that's not an internally inconsistent position given the research and given the circumstances under which maybe deliberate, what we would call cold cognition decisions are made versus the context in which hot cognition, stress, impulse, spur of the moment kinds of decisions are made. So I'll put that reference on the slide in case anybody is interested in taking a look at that.
Yeah, okay, that was actually a sophisticated answer. I want to go back just and say that the simplistic answer to this from our point of view on our sites, no, thank you, is that the young people are the experts. I mean, you know, you can think you know what's going on in their lives, and you will to a degree, but they are the experts. Now, they may be in a bad place right with where they're situated. They may have antisocial peers. There are techniques and tools we can use to help them figure out, you know, what we're trying to do, the context for which in which we're trying to do it, how to put a pro-social support team around them, but get their input, include them in the process. And what we found is that, you know, a lot of young people that would have been, you know, immediately kind of labeled as, you know, one of those antisocial kids that's, you know, got X, Y, and Z, and they're going to tell you the wrong answer. I mean, we talked this morning, you know, the hands were crossed, and he's going to say, why would I get a job? Well, you know, those young people can come around pretty quickly and understand why they get a job. And if you put the right team around them, the right supports, and get the right kind of peers around them, they will get there. So they're not going to be the kid that's got the arms crossed and saying, why would I get a job? So simple, but I think it's valuable.
First, thanks for your presentation. It's been very informative. But I'm from Ohio, so I'm going to jump in that pile of horse shit because I'm an Ed Latessa fan. And what we're doing in Ohio is we're working with UC very closely, and we are using a CBT model in our facilities. But the one thing I want to talk about is working with him and the folks in his shop. It's more than just the top 4 criminogenic needs. We also incorporate MI, strength-based approach. They talk about the importance of relationships. Doesn't matter how good your CBT model is, if you don't build relationships with kids, then the intervention may or may not be that effective. So I just wanted to put out a strength-based perspective for Ohio and UC.
Mr. Strength-based might have a comment to make.
I'm from Ohio, too.
And that's it.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I've gone up with Shay Bilchik and taken a look at some of the work that's been happening in Toledo and elsewhere, and there's some tremendous work that's happening up there. So that's absolutely the case, that understanding all of this in context. With no, now you're not going to get it. Limitations understood, and I have to confess I didn't make it to the talk this morning because I was driving in traffic to get here. But there are some fabulous things happening in Ohio around this. Now you go.
And a plug for Ohio is one of the fabulous things that's happening. It has nothing to do with treatment technologies. It's fixing the incentives for what we do with young people who've been arrested. And the Reclaim Ohio program, which encourages communities to take responsibility and keep youth close to home so their families can visit, is probably as powerful a treatment effect as any kind of CBT technologies we can think up. So fixing the incentives around the country is just as important, I think. And Ohio's done a great job of doing that.
Other questions or comments that you would like to make? Since everybody's weighing in on the earlier presentation, can I take my 30 seconds? And I've listened to Dr. Latessa for, well, you don't get a vote. I've been listening to him for, could it be 30 years, 35 years? And I have to say, in many respects, he's come a long way. I liked what he had to say with regard to the barriers. I mean, you can't quite get him to go too far with the barriers discussion, but he's at barriers now, recognizing some of these other factors, some of these non-criminogenic needs. Now, I actually had the honor late yesterday afternoon of sitting with the 14 juvenile reentry demo sites and had a chance to talk about non-criminogenic needs and how I thought that oftentimes in sort of more traditional criminological research, there are interpretations that may well be appropriate on the adult side, but when it comes to the juvenile side, it may not quite be as clear-cut. And I think part of it, where you've got a family court that's dealing with crossover population, dual jurisdiction, where you've got issues where there's great concern about other kinds of risk, not merely risk for reoffending, but risk of victimization, risk in terms of potentially long-term issues around mental health or substance abuse or any other range of issues that are out there. That has to be taken very seriously. And particularly a court that is equally concerned with dependency, abuse and neglect, and juvenile justice is really a different animal in a lot of ways. And they're not going to say, well, we don't really think it's quite as important to pay attention to a quote-unquote non-criminogenic need because that really doesn't correlate very well with reoffending. And I would say, you know, the problem with that view is that you're ignoring the fact that these courts, that these proceedings are very much concerned with something a lot more than just simple and plain recidivism. And I think when you just talk criminogenic need and risk as it relates to reoffending, you can kind of go off course a little bit and you start to sound to folks in juvenile justice like, well, wait a minute. That really doesn't sound like the juvenile justice system. Now, it's easier to make that case when you're talking about a jurisdiction where you've got dependency and delinquency that's all wrapped together, and there are many jurisdictions around the country where that's in fact the case. So they are not sort of preoccupied single-mindedly merely about recidivism. They're equally concerned about a range of other issues. Now, when you get into that setting, that opens up a whole series of additional questions. And I think that that tends to get very much lost in the kind of a conversation where you really are focused in on quote-unquote criminogenic needs. There are non-criminogenic needs that we need to pay a lot of attention to. The other point that I want to make, especially with juveniles and adolescents, I think that with regard to adolescents, and getting back to what we know from a developmental stage situation, some of those characteristics of dynamic risk factors, or the synonymous term would be criminogenic need, sound like an awful lot of 14-year-olds. So does that mean then, if we were to sort of assess them and find that they have a combination of those, what we've defined as criminogenic needs for 14-year-olds, that we ought to maybe just grab up all these 14-year-olds and say they're more at risk for certain kinds of negative outcomes? Most people would say, you're out of your mind. That's just a normal kind of developmental stage. It would be surprising if you didn't see some of that defiance, some of that rebelliousness, some of that risk-taking. That's a normal part of what kids go through. And in fact, when you've got a 13 or 14-year-old and you deny them the opportunity to do that, you've just created what we talked about yesterday afternoon, the self-fulfilling prophecy. You've now sort of made it much more likely that they are going to have troubles because you've denied them opportunities that they actually need to have in order to develop in pro-social ways. So I think, I think when you talk in very general terms, like you heard this morning, you run the risk of sort of veering off in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense in a juvenile justice, child welfare context. And I got to say, Jeff, I was a little surprised that you didn't talk more about positive youth development, because you, of course, have been one person who's probably advanced that discussion more than most people in the country. And I know that that's very, very important to your work.
But now you set me up for something I didn't want to talk about, which is... I'll get back to it quickly, but I just want to add in what David, when we focus on criminogenic needs, don't forget that means your outcome variable is arrest, which is a police function. There's a lot of crime that happens we never know about, and we all have different, let's say our behavior was all the same, we would have different probabilities of being arrested for that behavior. So you're allowing the social structure of law enforcement and police procedures and patrol policies to affect our core outcome variable that we focus on criminogenic needs. And I don't have to spell it out for you, I'm sure you know what I'm saying. But positive youth development, I'll just say really quickly, the reason I've been focusing on that is because it's been concerning to me. My opening question with people is, what's your theory? What are you trying to change? What's your theory? And if the theory is, on this I'm completely in agreement with Ed Latessa, if your focus is substance abuse and mental health and all these things, that may not be an accurate theory for what it is that's bringing kids before you, young people. So if young people are coming into the justice system, we should focus on the things that can help them stay out of the justice system. And that's not all about individual characteristics and behavior. It's a lot about communities and resources, connections to pro-social adults, pro-social opportunities. There's a lot of stuff that goes in. And I totally agree with you on this issue of if we just focus on criminogenic needs, we're undermining the core mission of what a juvenile court is and a family court. And once we do that, why do we need them? If we just focus on criminogenic needs, let's just put all teenagers in the criminal justice system, because we already have a system that focuses on criminogenic needs. If we have a different system for them because we think they are different, it's important we maintain a focus which is different.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel for some pretty interesting thought.